It was a quiet morning in the village, the kind where everything felt still, almost sacred. The soft murmur of wind through the trees, the rhythmic thumping of a farmer's hoe striking the earth, and the distant chatter of children playing near the village's central square created a symphony of simple, rural life. This was a place where everyone knew each other, where the only surprises came in the form of the occasional traveler or a stray animal. But today, there was an unfamiliar presence, a small, fragile monkey stumbling into the heart of the village. It moved with an awkward grace, its tiny hands reaching out for stability as it darted through the narrow streets. Its fur, once shiny and thick, now hung in clumps, matted and stained from days, maybe weeks, of exposure to the elements. The monkey's eyes were wide, scanning the unfamiliar surroundings, and though it tried to keep its footing, its movements were shaky, like a child in a strange place. The storm had torn through the forest just days before, a furious tempest that had uprooted trees and scattered the once cohesive troop of monkeys. The young one had been swept away from its family, caught in the chaos of nature's wrath. Now, alone and vulnerable, it had wandered into the village, unsure of what to expect, but driven by instinct to seek shelter. At first, the villagers didn't know what to make of it. Some stopped in their tracks, eyes wide with surprise. Others peered cautiously from their doorways or windows, unsure whether to feel pity or fear. Wild animals rarely ventured into the village, and even more rarely did they linger. There was a hesitation in the air, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to decide how to react. Some of the older villagers, who had seen more in their years, whispered among themselves, recalling stories of monkeys being troublemakers, stealing food, or creating havoc. They couldn't help but eye the young creature with suspicion. A few of the children, curious and unafraid, approached the monkey, but when it didn't respond the way they expected, when it didn't play or make a noise, they took a cautious step back, exchanging glances with their parents. The monkey, meanwhile, had no intention of causing trouble. It was hungry, confused, and terrified. Its small body trembled from the cold as it searched the edges of the village for shelter. The earth, so different from the treetops it had known, felt alien beneath its feet. The ground was hard, unyielding, and the smells were unfamiliar. But hunger drove it forward. The village, in all its strange normalcy, was both a place of hope and danger. And so it found a corner, tucked behind a modest wooden house on the outskirts, where a low-hanging tree provided some semblance of cover. There, it sat, pulling its thin arms close to its chest for warmth, its eyes darting back and forth as if waiting for something, someone, to offer safety. In the meantime, Grit was making his usual rounds. He was a dog known for his roughness, a creature of few words and fewer allegiances. Grit had lived on the outskirts of the village for as long as anyone could remember. He was an orphan of sorts, born into the streets and raised by the harsh realities of survival. He didn't trust people. He didn't trust other dogs. But survival? That was something he understood well. Grit had always kept to himself, finding food where he could, at the market, in alleyways, or through the occasional kindness of a villager who had learned to tolerate his presence. The villagers saw him as a necessary nuisance, a street dog that was just as likely to snap at you as he was to lie quietly in the sun. He was known for his quick reflexes, his ability to get in and out of tight spots without anyone noticing. Yet for all his street smarts, there was an emptiness in him. He had no family, no loyalty, just a need to survive. But that morning, something caught his attention. As he passed the corner of the house, he saw the monkey. It was an unexpected sight, a small creature huddled in a spot where no animal, especially not one so out of place, should be. Grit stopped, his ears flicking forward as he observed the trembling figure from a distance. He didn't approach it first. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply watched, his eyes narrowing in that familiar, calculating way. There was something in the monkey's stillness that made Grit pause. Something in the way it clung to the tree for support that made him reconsider his usual instinct to move on. The monkey wasn't begging for attention. It wasn't trying to provoke anything. It was merely existing, trying to survive in a world that had suddenly turned its back on it. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The morning sounds of the village faded into the background as Grit's gaze lingered on the small, vulnerable creature. The decision was a strange one that even Grit didn't quite understand. But he felt it nonetheless, a pull, a nudge toward the unexpected. Instead of walking away, he took a hesitant step forward. The monkey, noticing his movement, froze. Its small heart raced, and for a brief, sharp moment, it considered running. But something in the dog's steady gaze told it that escape would get it nowhere. It was as though, for the first time, the monkey realized that this was not a place of terror, not a place of hunting. It was a place where something else might be possible. The days that followed were a quiet continuation of village life, with farmers tending their fields and children playing near the river, unaware of the small, fragile creature that had stumbled into their midst. The monkey, though still terrified and uncertain, had found a place on the outskirts of the village, a tiny patch of shade beneath the branches of a lone tree. The villagers, some with pity and others with skepticism, kept their distance. The monkey had become a silent oddity, a passing curiosity. But Grit wasn't one to look away from the strange. The street dog was no stranger to the periphery, to the parts of life that others avoided. He prowled through the village daily, wandering the narrow alleys and quiet corners, his sharp senses always alert, always watching. Grit wasn't interested in the affairs of others. He had his own to worry about. Survival was his priority. And yet, he couldn't shake the image of the monkey. It wasn't just the animal's smallness that caught his attention. It was the way it sat, still and alone, like a fragile creature in a world too big and too indifferent to care. On the third day after the monkey's arrival, Grit decided to investigate further. He had no plan, no particular reason to engage. But something about the monkey's quiet presence drew him in. He padded silently down the familiar dirt road, his paws soft against the earth. As he passed the house on the corner, he saw it again, the little monkey still sitting by the tree, looking lost but oddly calm. Its eyes followed Grit's movements, wary but not frightened. Maybe it had grown used to his presence, or perhaps it was too exhausted to react. Grit stopped a few feet away. His eyes met the monkey's, and for a moment, neither moved. The monkey's gaze was hesitant, unsure. Yet there was an unmistakable hint of something more, need. And Grit, for reasons he couldn't quite understand, found himself taking a step closer. He didn't growl or bark. He didn't approach aggressively, as he would have done with a stray cat or another dog. Instead, Grit merely watched the monkey, his head tilted slightly to one side, as though trying to decipher this strange creature in front of him. His instincts were telling him to move on, to leave the monkey alone, but something about it, something in the way it was so utterly vulnerable, made Grit hesitate. The monkey, sensing no immediate threat, slowly uncurled from its huddled position and stretched out its small, stiff limbs. It was hungry. Grit had seen the signs before. Sunken eyes, an anxious glance toward the village, the desperate stillness of a creature who hadn't eaten in too long. The dog's sharp nose caught the faint smell of food in the air, a leftover scrap from a nearby stall. Without thinking, he reached into his own stash of leftovers and nudged a piece of bread toward the monkey. At first, the monkey didn't move. It just stared at the bread, unsure of whether to trust this strange, large animal offering food. It had been days since it had eaten anything substantial, and its instincts urged caution, telling it to stay hidden. But hunger was a powerful thing, and as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of the bread to its nose, the monkey's hesitation began to fade. Slowly, tentatively, it reached out, its small fingers trembling as they touched the food. Grit stood back, his head still low, his eyes never leaving the monkey. He watched as the small creature took a tiny bite of the bread, its mouth working clumsily but eagerly. Grit didn't move, didn't break the stillness of the moment. He simply watched, wondering what had compelled him to do this, to offer a piece of himself, a scrap of food, when he had never shown such patience or kindness to anyone before. The monkey, still cautious but now driven by the overwhelming need to eat, swallowed the bite and reached for more. Its hands, shaking slightly, grabbed another piece of bread, but this time, it didn't pull away. Instead, it looked up at Grit, its gaze softer now, less fearful. It didn't understand what had brought this dog to its side, why the dog wasn't attacking, why he was offering food instead of warning it to leave. Grit, for his part, wasn't sure what had made him act the way he had. He had seen stray animals before. He had chased off dogs, outwitted cats, and never once had he hesitated. But this was different. The monkey's vulnerability, its raw need for protection and care, had pierced through the tough exterior Grit had built over the years. As the monkey finished eating, it sat back on its haunches, eyes wide, but now showing something closer to gratitude than fear. There was a moment of quiet recognition between them. Grit's steady gaze met the monkey's trusting one, and in that instant, it became clear that something had shifted. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. They simply understood each other, for reasons neither could explain. The village, watching from behind windows and doorways, had been silently observing the strange interaction. Some of them had seen the dog approach the monkey, and a few of the older women had even shaken their heads in disbelief. "Look at that," one muttered, her voice tinged with surprise. "Grit, of all dogs, being kind to a monkey. I never thought I'd see the day." Others were more skeptical, casting wary glances at the two creatures. The monkey was still an outsider, an unknown, and dogs like Grit were wild, unpredictable. The villagers weren't sure what to think, but they couldn't deny the moment they had just witnessed. A moment that defied the natural order of things, where a street dog, hardened by the streets, had chosen to show compassion to a small, lost animal. For Grit, it was simple. He turned and began to walk away, as though it was just another day, another moment to add to his routine. But something had changed. His steps were slower now, less guarded. The monkey watched him go, its small form still perched on the ground, feeling something like hope stir within it, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this place was not as harsh as it had first seemed. Grit did not look back as he disappeared into the village, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel entirely alone. And the monkey, for the first time since the storm, didn't feel so lost. The days that followed seemed to stretch out in a way that was both familiar and new. The rhythm of village life continued, unchanged, but now there was a subtle shift in the air, something that the villagers couldn't quite place. It was in the way the children no longer looked over their shoulders when the monkey ventured near them, and in the way the adults began to watch, not with suspicion, but with something closer to curiosity. Grit, the street dog they had all written off as nothing more than a nuisance, had become a steady presence alongside the tiny creature, and for reasons no one could explain, it didn't seem so strange anymore. Each morning, Grit walked the village streets with the monkey trailing silently behind him. At first, it had only followed him out of hunger and desperation, but now, there was something more, a quiet trust, an unspoken bond that seemed to grow with each passing day. The monkey no longer hesitated when Grit moved, nor did it shrink back when he stopped to sniff a tree or explore a new scent. It had found comfort in his steadiness, in the way he navigated the world without fear, without the vulnerability the monkey had once felt so acutely. And Grit, for all his gruffness, began to feel something shift within himself. The monkey had become a constant companion, but it was more than that. It was a reminder of something he had long forgotten, that there was more to life than just surviving. Each time he returned with a scrap of food from the village market, it was no longer just for himself. The monkey waited, sitting quietly by the side of the road, watching him approach with those large, searching eyes. At first, Grit had brought food only out of a sense of obligation, an instinctive desire to provide for the creature who had so unwittingly entered his life. But as time passed, he began to look forward to the little exchanges, watching the monkey's fingers twitch in anticipation, hearing the soft chittering sounds of contentment as it ate. There was something strangely comforting in these small moments, something that made Grit feel less like a solitary wanderer and more like a part of something bigger, something that had been quietly forming without his awareness. It wasn't just the food that bound them together. The monkey, despite its small size, began to show signs of its own quiet strength. It had become adept at finding small bits of food when Grit wasn't around, sniffing out scraps behind the market stalls or snatching fallen fruit from the ground. The villagers, no longer wary of the monkey's presence, began to toss bits of bread or pieces of fruit toward it, and it had learned to accept the gifts with a careful, cautious gratitude. Grit, however, had a way of protecting the monkey that the villagers hadn't expected. He wasn't just guarding it from other animals or from the occasional stray dog that wandered through the village. There were times when the larger, more aggressive dogs would wander near the edge of the village, their growls carrying through the air like a warning. Grit would stand between them and the monkey, his hackles raised, his body tense with a quiet but undeniable threat. The larger dogs, seeing the street dog's confidence and the monkey's proximity, would back down, avoiding the confrontation altogether. Grit, always calm, never showed any sign of aggression beyond the protective posture that made it clear this was his charge, and no one was to come too close. The villagers, observing this, began to take note of the unusual bond between the two. At first, they thought it was merely an oddity, a curiosity that would eventually fade as the monkey adjusted to its new surroundings. But days turned into weeks, and the monkey became a fixture of the village, sitting quietly beside the children during their play, watching as the villagers tended their crops, or sitting with Grit in the shaded corners of the square, where the light filtered through the leaves and cast dappled shadows on the ground. The monkey no longer seemed out of place. It had found a rhythm in the village, a rhythm that mirrored the calm assurance of Grit. The relationship between them, once tenuous and fragile, had evolved into something deeper, something unspoken. Grit didn't need to watch over the monkey all the time. He didn't need to guard it at every moment. But he did so anyway, not because it was a duty, but because the monkey had become part of his life in a way that nothing else had. In a life that had been defined by solitude and survival, Grit had found something that felt like companionship, something that wasn't born out of necessity, but out of the quiet, growing bond between him and the little creature that had wandered into his world. And the monkey, for its part, had found something it had never known before: safety. It no longer huddled in corners or watched the other villagers with fearful eyes. It had learned that this village, despite its initial wariness, had a place for it. It had learned to trust Grit not just because he provided food, but because he had shown the kind of protection that spoke to the deepest need within the monkey, a need for connection, for belonging. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the village, the monkey climbed onto Grit's back for the first time. It wasn't a leap of faith, but more of a natural next step. Grit had been sitting lazily in the shade, his eyes half closed, when the monkey, with its quiet curiosity, had hopped up onto his back, nestling against the scruffy fur of his shoulders. Grit didn't move at first. He simply let the small creature settle into the comfort of his warmth. The villagers watched the scene from a distance, their initial skepticism slowly turning into something softer. They had watched this unusual pairing for weeks now, and for all the oddity of it, they couldn't deny the bond between the two. The street dog, once seen as nothing more than an unruly nuisance, had become a protector, a guardian of sorts. The little monkey, once a creature lost in the world, had found something it hadn't known before: a place in this quiet, bustling village. Grit, with his weathered, world-weary eyes, sat contentedly in the afternoon sun, his body language relaxed, almost peaceful. The monkey, secure in the newfound safety of the dog's presence, curled up against him, its breathing steady. In that moment, it was clear to the villagers that this bond, though unexpected, was something more than mere companionship. It was a quiet testament to the unspoken ways in which the world worked. In a place where people and animals lived side by side, it was the gentleness of a stray dog and a lost monkey that had proven to be the most enduring force of all. As weeks turned into months, the bond between Grit and the monkey became undeniable, and the once skeptical villagers had no choice but to acknowledge the growing warmth between them. What had started as an odd curiosity had blossomed into something deeper, an unspoken partnership that transformed not just their relationship, but the very atmosphere of the village. The children, once unsure of the small, skittish monkey, now ran to greet it every morning, excitedly calling its name as they gathered in the square. They had learned to see the monkey not as a strange intruder, but as a companion, a playful soul who seemed just as curious about the world as they were. The monkey, in turn, had grown more confident with each passing day. It no longer hid behind trees or scurried off at the sound of approaching footsteps. Instead, it sat in the sun, swinging from branches, or followed the children as they played. Its presence, once unsettling, had become as natural as the laughter that echoed through the village. Grit, as always, was by its side. The street dog's once solitary nature had softened over time, and though he never sought attention, the villagers had come to see him as more than just a stray. He had earned their respect through his quiet protection and loyalty. Grit was no longer the untrustworthy, rough street dog that people crossed the street to avoid. He was a guardian, a protector of the village's smallest, most vulnerable member. The villagers noticed it in the way Grit had begun to change his habits. No longer did he stay at the edge of the village, lurking in the shadows. He now walked through the center of the square, his head held high, his stride purposeful and unhurried. It was as if he had become part of the community, even if he still kept his distance from people. When the monkey was nearby, Grit was never far behind. He kept watch, his sharp eyes scanning for any threat, even when no one else seemed to notice. It was the same with the food. Grit, who had once scavenged and fought for every scrap, now found himself sharing what he had without hesitation. In the mornings, when the village baker tossed out stale bread, Grit would bring a piece to the monkey, who eagerly accepted it, waiting patiently as Grit nibbled at his share. The villagers, who had once avoided Grit's rough demeanor, had started to offer him food as well. And when they saw the monkey eating beside him, their perception shifted. No longer did they see the dog as a scavenger. He was simply a creature who had learned to survive, just like anyone else. And then there were the nights. Grit had always been a nocturnal creature, moving through the village's quiet streets under the cover of darkness. But now there was a change in his movements. When night fell, Grit no longer prowled alone. The monkey, whose fear of the dark had slowly faded, now curled up next to the dog, its small form nestling against the warmth of Grit's side. The two would stay together, the soft glow of lantern light flickering in the distance, until the village fell into deep silence. The bond between them had become so instinctive that it no longer required thought. Grit watched over the monkey as he had always done, but now there was a gentleness to it, a quiet understanding that this, too, was his responsibility. The villagers, watching from their windows or sitting on their porches, often spoke in hushed voices about the strange partnership that had formed before their eyes. Some marveled at the unexpected tenderness between the two. Others saw it as a sign of something deeper, something magical in the way life could sometimes surprise you. But no one doubted the truth of it. The street dog, with his once rough edges, had found something to protect, and the monkey, orphaned and lost, had found a companion, a savior in the most unlikely form. One evening, a storm blew through the village, a sharp, cold wind that rattled the shutters and bent the trees. The villagers, accustomed to such weather, went about securing their homes, but there was a sense of urgency in their movements. The monkey, who had been perched on a low branch, suddenly froze. Its small body tensed, its eyes scanning the storm. Grit, who had been lying in the village square, immediately stood and moved to the tree, his instincts sharp. The monkey, feeling the surge of fear that always came with a storm, scrambled down to Grit's side, its small hands trembling. Without hesitation, Grit moved closer to the tree, nudging the monkey gently toward the safety of the village homes. The monkey followed, looking up at him as if it understood, as if it trusted him completely. The storm raged, but Grit and the monkey found shelter beneath the eaves of an abandoned building at the edge of the village. The rain began to pour, sheets of water that soaked the earth and turned the streets into small rivers. The wind howled, making the trees bend and sway. But beneath the shelter, the dog and the monkey sat together, side by side, watching the storm pass. Grit, as always, was the protector, but this time, it was more than just the monkey he was guarding. It was the promise of safety, of home, that they had both found in each other. The villagers watched from their windows, seeing the two figures huddled together against the storm. And in that moment, something changed. They saw Grit not as a stray, not as the rough dog who had once caused trouble, but as a guardian. They saw the monkey not as an outsider, but as part of the village, a part of the fabric of their community. They had learned to accept this unlikely pair not because they were perfect or predictable, but because they had something that resonated deeply within the hearts of everyone who watched them. By the time the storm had passed, the village had been transformed in more ways than one. The relationship between Grit and the monkey had become a symbol of something larger, of trust, protection, and the quiet strength that could emerge in the most unexpected places. The villagers no longer saw a street dog and an orphaned monkey. They saw two beings who had found each other, who had created a life together in the heart of a small village, a life that no one could have predicted, but that somehow felt like it had always belonged there. The festival was in full swing by the time the circus master arrived in the village, his caravan of performers and animals rolling in under a sky painted with the golden hues of late afternoon. The excitement in the air was palpable, and the streets buzzed with the vibrant energy of the event. Laughter and music spilled out of the marketplace as children ran, chasing each other with ribbons in their hands. The aroma of roasted meats and baked bread filled the air, and the sound of drums echoed down the streets. Yet amid the festivity, something unsettling was brewing on the outskirts of the village. A stranger, tall and imposing, walked into the heart of the celebration. A circus master with a reputation for taming wild animals and turning them into spectacle. His caravan, drawn by colorful wagons and exotic animals, had made its way from the neighboring town, bringing with it the promise of entertainment and riches. But the man's eyes were drawn to something else entirely. Word had spread about the monkey that had wandered into the village months ago, and the circus master had heard tales of its unusual friendship with the stray dog, Grit. The monkey had become a symbol of curiosity and affection, but in the circus master's mind, it represented opportunity, a chance to take this wild creature, tame it, and profit from its unusual bond with the dog. As the circus master made his way to the center of the village, the villagers, who had grown fond of the monkey and the street dog, looked on with unease. They had heard of the man's reputation. They had seen him train animals to perform tricks for crowds, seen the way he treated his animals as little more than commodities. The villagers were hesitant, unwilling to part with the monkey that had become an unexpected, beloved member of their community. Still, the circus master's offer was tempting. He promised them a significant sum of money in exchange for the monkey, telling them it would have a chance to perform on grand stages, drawing audiences from all over the region. His words were smooth, persuasive, and the idea of wealth for the village hung in the air like a sweet temptation. As he spoke, Grit appeared from the shadows at the edge of the crowd, his piercing gaze fixed on the circus master, the man who had so easily reduced the monkey to a prize to be claimed. The street dog's instincts flared, his hackles rising, and the monkey, sensing the tension, hesitated at Grit's side. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the danger in the air. But Grit didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't need to. The monkey, who had grown so used to the protection and comfort of the street dog, turned to look at Grit, its small face anxious, as if asking for reassurance. Grit, never one to show emotion, simply stood there, his steady presence enough to keep the circus master at bay. The villagers, sensing that something important was unfolding, stepped back, giving Grit the space he needed to make his move. The circus master took a step forward, eyes gleaming, but Grit was already moving. He crossed the square with slow, deliberate steps, his body calm, but full of unspoken authority. The monkey followed behind him, staying close to his side, as if drawn by an invisible thread. The street dog's movements were fluid, graceful despite his rough appearance, and his eyes never left the circus master. The man faltered for a moment, surprised by the dog's sudden, unwavering stance. Grit's silence was deafening, his gaze unyielding. For the first time since arriving, the circus master felt a flicker of uncertainty. His smooth talk faltered, and the crowd, sensing the tension, grew still. Without a word, Grit positioned himself between the circus master and the monkey. He wasn't snarling or threatening. There was no need. His presence alone was enough to send a message. This monkey was not for sale, not for his exploitation, not for anyone's amusement. For a long, charged moment, the circus master stood frozen, his gaze flicking from Grit to the villagers who watched in silence. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. The man opened his mouth to speak, to argue, but the villagers were already moving. They stepped forward, their collective support evident in the way they positioned themselves around the dog and the monkey, creating a shield of solidarity that spoke louder than words. The circus master had underestimated them all. "You can't take them," one of the older villagers spoke quietly, but firmly, his voice carrying through the square. "Not now. Not ever." There was no further argument. The circus master's eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as though he might challenge them. But then, as if the weight of the villagers' unity had finally sunk in, he simply nodded and turned away. He hadn't come for a fight. He had come for profit, and in that moment, he saw that it would be a fight he would lose. Slowly, he retreated, his caravan following behind him, the once confident air of entitlement now replaced by a quiet resignation. As the circus master and his caravan vanished down the road, the village stood in stunned silence. It had been a simple thing, really, a quiet stand against a man who had tried to take something they had come to love. But in that moment, Grit had done more than just protect the monkey. He had stood as a symbol of the village's resilience, their willingness to protect what was theirs, to guard the things they had come to hold dear. The monkey, who had been so still throughout the entire confrontation, let out a soft chirp and, without hesitation, climbed up on Grit's back, nestling into the familiar warmth of his fur. The villagers, their eyes soft with admiration and gratitude, stepped closer. The children gathered around them, asking questions, curious about the quiet power they had just witnessed. The street dog, the once rough wanderer, had become the hero of the day. And in that moment, as the sun dipped lower and the evening air filled with the sounds of music and laughter once more, the village realized something they had perhaps taken for granted: the strength of their unity, the power of the unlikely bonds they had forged. They hadn't just defended the monkey from the circus master. They had defended their right to love, to protect, and to hold on to the things that mattered most. Grit, as always, remained humble. His tail wagged once, almost imperceptibly, and he turned away from the crowd, his eyes scanning the horizon. The monkey clung to his back, content and safe, as the village celebrated in the fading light of day. There was no fanfare, no grand gesture, just the quiet presence of a dog and a monkey who had found each other in a world that had once seemed too large and too uncertain. And in that moment, they knew they had found something worth fighting for. The days after the circus master's departure were quieter, but there was an undeniable shift in the village. The bond between Grit and the monkey had become something more than just a curiosity. It had become a testament to the strength of the village itself. The event had united them in a way no one had expected, and it was clear that their lives had been forever changed. As the seasons turned, the village embraced the growing connection between the two. Grit was no longer just a street dog. He had become a protector, a guardian, not just of the monkey, but of the village. His rough exterior had softened over time, not because he had been tamed, but because the village had accepted him as he was: wild, independent, but fiercely loyal to those who had earned his trust. The villagers no longer avoided him or treated him as an outsider. They saw him as part of the fabric of their community, a dog who had become a quiet hero in their midst. The monkey, for its part, had settled into the rhythm of village life. It no longer shrank away from the sounds of human voices or the movements of the villagers. The children, who had once been afraid of its unpredictable nature, now welcomed it into their games. It had become a fixture in the square, sitting on the benches beside the elderly, sharing in their stories, and playing with the children as they ran past. In the evenings, it would curl up next to Grit under the old oak tree at the edge of the village, the two of them a silent presence as the village carried on around them. But despite this peace, something lingered in the air. The bond between Grit and the monkey had always been undeniable, but the truth of their relationship had only recently begun to take shape in the hearts of the villagers. The two had become inseparable, their loyalty to each other a quiet but powerful force. Yet, there were still those who wondered what would happen when the time came for the monkey to grow up, to become the wild creature it had once been before it had found its place among them. Would it remain in the village, living alongside Grit, or would it someday return to the jungle, to its roots? As the seasons changed, so did the monkey. It grew more confident, more agile, and its small frame filled out with the strength that had once been so absent. The villagers watched in awe as it scaled trees with ease, leaping from branch to branch, its small body full of life and energy. It was a creature of the wild, even if it had found safety in their village. Grit, ever the protector, stood watch from below, his eyes never leaving the monkey as it danced through the branches, just out of reach. There was a quiet understanding between them. The monkey would always be free, but as long as it was in the village, Grit would be there. One afternoon, the village gathered for a harvest feast to celebrate the bounty of the year. The air was thick with the smell of fresh bread, roasting meats, and vegetables. Laughter and music echoed through the village square, and the families that had lived in the village for generations danced together, their faces lit with the joy of community. It was a time of celebration, of reflection, and of gratitude for all that had been shared and built together. Grit and the monkey were present, as they always were now, but they stayed at the edges of the gathering, quietly observing. The monkey, having grown accustomed to the festivities, perched on Grit's back, occasionally reaching down to snatch a bit of bread or fruit from the table. The dog, ever watchful, kept his gaze fixed on the surrounding area, his ears pricked for any sound of trouble. But there was none. For the first time in a long while, the village felt whole, peaceful, secure, and united. As the night drew on, the village elders gathered around the fire, recounting the stories of the past, tales of old heroes and times long gone. They spoke of the land they had tilled, the struggles they had faced, and the dreams they had built together. And in the midst of the storytelling, one of the elders spoke of the dog and the monkey, of the bond that had formed between them and how it had brought the village together. They are a testament, the elder said, his voice steady and warm, to the power of trust, of friendship, of the bonds that tie us all together. They are not just animals, they are a part of us. And we, in turn, are part of them. The villagers who had gathered around the fire nodded in agreement. They had seen it, the way the dog and the monkey had protected each other, the way they had formed a family of their own, one that extended beyond species, beyond boundaries. They understood now that the love between Grit and the monkey was not a fleeting thing. It was a foundation upon which something greater had been built, a community that knew the importance of connection, of looking out for one another, of sharing what they had. Later that evening, as the village settled into the quiet of the night, the monkey sat beside Grit, both of them gazing up at the stars. The soft light of the fire flickered in their eyes, and for a moment there was only the sound of crickets and the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. The monkey reached over and touched Grit's head gently, a small, affectionate gesture that spoke volumes about the depth of their bond. Grit, ever the stoic guardian, allowed the moment to pass without a word, but his eyes softened. The monkey, in its own way, had shown that it no longer felt the need to prove itself. It had found its place, not in the wilds of the jungle, but in this small village where it had been accepted, loved, and protected. It had found a family in Grit, and in the village a home. The future, though uncertain, was something they would face together. As the moon rose high in the sky, casting its silvery light over the village, Grit stood up, stretching his legs and shaking out his fur. The monkey climbed onto his back, just as it had done so many times before. Together, they walked toward the small shelter they had made under the old oak tree. There, in the stillness of the night, they would rest, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it as they always had, side by side. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.